In the dark heart of 1871, when justice was blind and terror wore a white hood, one man rode against the tide. They called him a phantom, a demon, a shadow born of the night itself, a lone rider, cloaked in darkness, who meted out a justice the law refused to deliver. But this was no ordinary vigilante. This was a ghost forged in the fires of war, a black man who hunted the hunters. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Now, let's journey back to 1871, to a town in Alabama, where fear wore a white hood, and a legend was about to be born in darkness. The late afternoon sun hung low and heavy in the Alabama sky, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched like grasping fingers across the dusty road. Isaac Granger, a man in his late 20s, rode his sturdy horse into the town of Redemption, the name itself a bitter irony he was only just beginning to taste. He carried the lean, hard physique of a soldier, forged in the crucible of a war that was supposed to have settled everything, and possessed the watchful, ever-scanning eyes of a scout who had learned that survival depended on seeing what others missed. He remembered Redemption as a place of noise and life, the air filled with the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the chatter of market day, and the easy laughter of neighbors. The town he entered now was a hollow echo of that memory. It was unnervingly quiet, the silence broken only by the tired creak of his saddle and the soft plod of his horse's hooves in the thick red dust. Storefronts that once displayed their wares with pride were now blinded by boarded-up windows. The few people on the street, both black and white, hurried along with their heads down, their shoulders hunched as if against a perpetual storm. They moved with a furtive energy, avoiding eye contact not just with him, but with each other, as if a shared glance was a transaction too costly to afford. The air, thick and humid, seemed to carry a tension that had nothing to do with the weather, a palpable, unspoken dread that settled deep in Isaac's bones. His initial feeling of hopeful homecoming, a warmth he had nursed for 4 long years, began to curdle into a cold knot of disillusionment and suspicion. He had ridden home to find peace, but the atmosphere was not one of peace. It was one of a ceasefire, fragile and temporary. He felt like a stranger in the very place that had given him his name. His path led him away from the town's dead center, toward the small farm of Sarah, an elderly black woman who had been a close and cherished friend of his mother. As he approached the property, the cold knot in his stomach tightened. Her land, which he recalled as a testament to meticulous care and tireless work, was now showing the unmistakable signs of fear and neglect. The fences, once straight and strong, sagged in disrepair, their posts leaning like tired old men. A vegetable garden lay choked with weeds, its bounty surrendered. Most jarring of all was a wide, ugly patch of scorched black wood marring the wall of her barn, a violent scar against the weathered gray timber. Sarah emerged from the small cabin as he dismounted, her face a road map of worry that broke into a fragile smile. She rushed to him, embracing him with a strength that belied her years. But her joy was a flickering candle in a gale of fear. "Isaac, Lord be praised. You're home," she breathed, her hands clutching his arms. "But this ain't the home you left, child." Her touch was trembling. "I can see that, Sarah," Isaac said, his voice low as he looked from her haunted eyes to the blackened barn wall. "What happened here? What's got everyone so spooked?" It's like the war never ended. Sarah pulled him toward the relative safety of her porch, her gaze darting toward the tree line as if the woods themselves had hostile eyes. She lowered her voice to a strained, urgent whisper. "It's the night riders," she said, the words tasting like poison. "Goblins from a nightmare, dressed in white sheets. They come in the night, Isaac. They burn, they whip, they take what they want. They want to scare us back into chains or into the ground." She wrung her hands, the skin worn and dry. "The sheriff, he does nothing. He looks the other way, or worse, he smiles when he hears the stories. There's no one to stop them, child. No one." Isaac listened, his jaw tightening until his teeth ached. The weariness from his long journey was burned away by a slow, simmering anger. He felt the crushing weight of the community's helplessness in Sarah's quiet terror, a terror that had become as normal and as constant as the setting of the Sunday. That night, sleep offered no refuge. He was jolted from a shallow, restless doze by the sound of distant, frantic shouts and the faint, angry pulse of an orange glow against the dark horizon. Every instinct from his years as a scout screamed into high alert. He dressed quickly in dark clothing and slipped out of Sarah's cabin, melting into the familiar woods that bordered her property. He moved with a stealth that was second nature, his feet finding purchase on the pine needle floor without a whisper of sound. The glow grew brighter, the shouts clearer, laced with a guttural cruelty that made his blood run cold. He followed the terrible light until he reached a ridge overlooking the small homestead of the Johnson family, a hard-working couple with 2 young children. From his concealed position, he witnessed the nightmare Sarah had described. A dozen hooded figures on horseback circled the modest house like vultures, their white robes a ghostly, obscene sight in the flickering torchlight. Their horses, agitated by the fire and the fear, stamped and snorted, their breath pluming in the cool night air. Isaac remained perfectly still, his body rigid with a fury so profound it felt like a physical sickness. His training took over, a cold, tactical part of his mind detaching from the horror to analyze the threat. He counted the riders, 12 of them. He noted their weapons, a mix of shotguns, pistols, and the burning torches they wielded like instruments of hell. He studied their leader, a man who sat on a finer, taller horse, his posture radiating an arrogant authority as he barked distorted commands from beneath his pointed hood. Isaac absorbed the sheer, unrestrained brutality of the scene. He watched as they dragged Mr. Johnson from his home, his pleas for mercy lost in the jeers of his tormentors. He watched as they tied him to a post and brought down a whip, the crack of the leather a sickening sound that echoed across the valley. He watched as they set the family's small cotton shed ablaze, the flames leaping into the sky, consuming a year's worth of hope and labor in a matter of minutes. The air was filled with the sharp crackle of the fire, the splintering of wood, the hateful, muffled shouts from under the hoods, and the terrified, muffled sobs of Mrs. Johnson and her children huddled on their porch. For Isaac, this was not an abstract threat or a distant rumor. This was a visceral, personal assault on people he knew, on the very idea of the peace he had fought for, the promise of his service. The meaning behind the blue uniform he had worn with pride felt like a bitter, devastating lie. He did not return to Sarah's farm. Instead, he made his way through the darkened woods to the dilapidated cabin that had once belonged to his family. It stood on the edge of town, abandoned and forgotten, a skeleton of a home. Inside, the air was stale with the ghosts of memory. By the flickering, uncertain light of a single lantern, he knelt on the floor and unpacked a worn leather satchel, the contents of which were the last remnants of his former life. He carefully laid each item on the dusty floorboards. There was his folded Union Scout uniform, the blue wool still vibrant, a tangible link to a time of purpose and conviction. Beside it, he placed a well-oiled Colt revolver, its metal cool and heavy in his hand. Next came a razor-sharp Bowie knife, its blade gleaming in the lamplight. And finally, his collection of tracking tools, small, intricate pieces of metal and wood that had saved his life more times than he could count. He picked up the uniform, the fabric a stark reminder of a war he had believed was won, a victory that was supposed to have purchased freedom and equality. He thought of the men he had fought alongside, black and white, who had bled and died for that ideal. Now, that same ideal was being openly mocked and burned away by masked cowards under the cover of darkness. He realized with a chilling certainty that the official war may have been over, but a new, undeclared war was being waged right here, on his home. This was a war of whispers and shadows, of terror and complicity. He could not fight it as Isaac Granger, the soldier. An open fight would be suicide. And the law, the supposed arbiter of justice, was either blind or an active participant. He had to use their own weapons against them. He had to become a whisper. He had to use the darkness. He had to become fear itself. He reached back into the satchel and pulled out a small, leather-bound journal and a pen. He opened it to a clean page, the first time he had felt the need to write in years. Dipping the pen in ink, his hand steady, he wrote, October, 1871. Return to redemption to find not peace, but a new war. A war of whispers and shadows. The law is blind or worse, complicit. If they hunt in the dark, then the dark is where they will be met. He closed the journal, the words on the page a silent vow, a declaration of intent. He then picked up the Colt revolver, his movements methodical and precise, the quiet clicks of the cylinder turning, the soft whisper of an oiled cloth over the barrel, the cold final snap as he loaded the chambers. These were the sounds of a decision being forged into reality. His face, illuminated by the solitary lantern, was set in a mask of cold, unyielding resolve. The soldier was gone. A hunter was being born. In the seclusion of his family's decaying cabin, Isaac systematically began the grim work of erasing himself. This was not a task of concealment, but of creation. He was not hiding Isaac Granger. He was forging the phantom rider from the raw materials of necessity and rage. He worked with a silent, grim purpose that filled the small, dusty space with a palpable intensity. His first task was to create the color of night itself. He gathered walnuts from the woods, their green husks staining his fingers a deep, telltale brown, and boiled them down in a rusted pot over a low fire. To this dark brew, he added charcoal, crushed into a fine powder, creating a dye as black and unforgiving as a starless midnight. Into this bubbling concoction, he submerged his durable canvas trousers and a simple, collarless shirt, stirring them with a stick until the fabric drank the darkness and became one with it. He hung them to dry in the cabin's shadows, away from the prying eyes of the Sunday. Next, he turned to the mask. From a piece of thick black leather saved from an old saddle repair kit, he cut a shape that would cover his entire face. From hairline to jaw, he worked the leather with his knife, carving two narrow horizontal slits for his eyes, just wide enough to see but too small to betray the color or emotion within them. He punched small holes along the edges and threaded a leather thong through them, ensuring it would fit snugly, becoming a second skin. This was not a disguise. It was a new face, a face of pure, cold retribution. His attention then shifted to his equipment. His saddle, a sturdy piece of army surplus, was functional but not silent. He took strips of old cloth and painstakingly wrapped the metal stirrups, the buckles, and any part of the harness that might jingle or scrape. Sound was a luxury he could not afford, a betrayal he would not permit. Every movement had to be as quiet as a shadow passing over the ground. Finally, there was his partner in this endeavor, the one soul he would trust in the coming war. His horse was a powerful, intelligent black stallion named Midnight, a creature as dark as the identity Isaac was creating. In the hidden glade behind the cabin, he began a new kind of training. He rode Midnight for hours without a bridle, teaching the horse to respond to the slightest shifts in his weight, the gentle pressure of a knee, a soft click of the tongue. He trained him to stand motionless for long stretches, to move through dense undergrowth without a sound, to be not just a mount, but an extension of his own will, a living, breathing piece of the night. The entire process was a solemn ritual. With each piece of the costume he completed, with each silent command the horse learned to obey, he felt a piece of his old self, the hopeful soldier, the returning son, fall away. He was shedding the man who had bled for a promise and embracing the cold, vengeful purpose he had now chosen. It was a transformation not of the body, but of the soul. A man putting on a mask to become a symbol, a ghost to hunt the ghouls. Days later, the whispers found him. The wind carried the news, passed from one fearful mouth to another, that the Klan planned to ride against the Washington family. The Washingtons were guilty of no crime save for success, having worked, saved, and finally bought their own small plot of land, a 50-acre testament to their resilience that the night riders saw as an intolerable act of defiance. Isaac learned they would gather in a clearing near the old cypress swamp before their ride, a place where they felt invincible, where they would light a cross to sanctify their hatred before unleashing it. That night, as the Klansmen assembled, their mood was arrogant and jovial. They were a dozen strong, their white robes stark against the encroaching darkness of the swamp. They were making a sport of terror, their laughter echoing unnaturally through the trees as they prepared their torches and the crude wooden cross. They were so confident in their power, so certain of the fear they inspired, that they never once thought to look into the deeper shadows. That was where Isaac waited. He was a part of the darkness, silent and still atop Midnight. He had no intention of meeting them with brute force. His plan was to dismantle their courage, to turn their own fear against them. He began not with a shout, but with a stone. He had marked the location earlier. A large, papery hornet's nest, hanging from a low branch directly above the spot where the Klansmen had carelessly tied their horses. His aim was true. The stone struck the nest with a dull thud. and the night exploded with the furious buzzing of 1,000 angry hornets. The horses, already skittish, screamed in pain and terror, pulling violently at their reins. Several broke free, galloping madly into the swamp, while the others bucked and kicked, creating chaos at the edge of the clearing. As the clansmen turned in confusion, shouting at the sudden pandemonium, the phantom rider emerged. He didn't charge. He flowed out of the shadows like smoke, a dark shape on a dark horse. In his hand, he held not a gun, but a long black bullwhip. The whip cracked through the air, the sound sharp and loud, echoing like a gunshot and making the clansmen flinch. The leather lash, a blur in the torchlight, snapped with pinpoint accuracy, wrapping around the barrel of a shotgun and ripping it from a man's grasp. Another crack, and a burning torch was sent flying, its flame extinguished as it tumbled into a puddle of murky water. He rode midnight directly into their gathering, the great horse a terrifying, unstoppable force. They scattered like dry leaves tripping over their own robes. The half-lit cross, the symbol of their power, was trampled into the dirt under midnight's powerful hooves, its nascent flame smothered in mud. Throughout the attack, Isaac said nothing. His silence was his most terrifying weapon. These men were used to screams, to pleas, to curses. They were met with an unnerving, inhuman quiet that stripped them of their bravado. This was not a man they were fighting. It was a force, a specter from the swamp itself. He did not kill. He disarmed. He unhorsed. He humiliated. He left them with stinging welts from the whip, with the terror of their spooked horses, and with the deep, abiding shame of their own cowardice. He shattered their sense of power, their anonymity, and their belief that the night belonged to them. Then, as quickly as he had appeared, he melted back into the darkness, leaving behind a scene of chaos, confusion, and a newfound fear. The next morning, the freedmen's community was electric with a new kind of energy. The news, carried on hushed, excited whispers, spread from cabin to cabin, from field to field. The Washingtons, safe and unharmed, told a story that grew with each telling, a story of a shadow on horseback, a dark avenger who had descended upon the Klan like a storm. They spoke of a figure who moved like smoke, whose whip cracked like lightning, and who had vanished without a trace, leaving the night riders scattered and broken. For the first time in a long time, the sun seemed to shine a little brighter. A flicker of hope, fragile but persistent, was ignited in the hearts of a people who had known only fear. The night, it seemed, no longer belonged exclusively to the Klan. Meanwhile, in the white community, a different set of stories began to circulate. The defeated Klansmen, nursing their wounds and their shattered pride, could not admit they had been routed by a single man. To excuse their failure, they wove their own exaggerated tales. They spoke of a demon summoned from the swamp, a vengeful spirit with eyes of cold fire. It wasn't natural, one was heard to say in the town's saloon, his voice still trembling. The air grew cold where he rode. He didn't make a sound, but the devil's own work was in that whip. Another claimed the rider's horse had hooves of fire and breathed smoke. These tales, born of shame and superstition, served Isaac's purpose perfectly. He was no longer a man. He was a legend, a phantom, his power magnified by the very fear of those he hunted. Fear was now mixed with wonder, and in the black community, a dangerous, thrilling sense of defiance began to take root. The Phantom Rider had not only saved the Washingtons, he had given his people a weapon of their own, a story, a belief that they were not entirely alone in the darkness. To stay ahead, Isaac knew he needed more than just whispers. He needed intelligence. Days after the attack, he shed the skin of the Phantom Rider and once again became Isaac Granger, a quiet man looking for work. He rode into town, not on the formidable Midnight, but on a nondescript mare borrowed from Sarah. He wore simple farmer's clothes, his posture slightly stooped, his eyes downcast, the very picture of a man trying to be invisible. His destination was the general store, a place that served as the town's unofficial heart, where goods, money, and most importantly, information were exchanged. The store was run by a man named Mr. Abernathy, a nervous bird, like man with a fundamentally decent heart, but a spine made of jelly. He disapproved of the Klan's violence, but was far too afraid of their power to ever speak out against them. He wrung his hands constantly, as if trying to wash them of the town's collective guilt. Isaac entered the store and gave a quiet nod to Abernathy. He busied himself looking at sacks of flour, pretending to be just another farmer, while his ears, honed by years of scouting, tuned in to the conversations around him. Two patrons, burly men with the self-satisfied air of those who believe they are on the right side of history, were discussing the strange business from the other night. Heard the boys got spooked by a panther over by the swamp, one of them said with a dismissive snort, leaning against the counter. The other man, a known Klan sympathizer with a cruel twist to his mouth, leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial rasp. "Weren't no panther," he hissed. "It was something unnatural, demonic. But don't you worry. They're meeting again Friday to sort it out. A proper meeting, with all the leaders, over by the old quarry. They aim to hunt this thing down." Isaac's heart gave a single hard thump, but his expression remained placid. He had it, the time and the place. He picked up a small sack of flour and another of salt and brought them to the counter, placing them down gently. "Just need these, Mr. Abernathy," he said, his voice quiet and unremarkable. He paid his coins, his eyes catching Abernathy's for just a second. He saw a flicker of something in the storekeeper's gaze, a mixture of fear and a strange unspoken plea. As Abernathy handed him his change, their fingers brushed. The storekeeper's hands were clammy. "Strange times, Isaac," Abernathy murmured, his voice barely audible, refusing to meet his eyes again. "Just be careful." Isaac gave a slight nod, a silent acknowledgement that passed between them. He had confirmed the value of passive intelligence, of being a ghost even in the broad light of day. He had learned the Klan's next move without raising a single suspicion, and he had seen in Abernathy's eyes that he was not entirely alone in his hatred for the Night Riders. He was one step ahead, and in this war of shadows, that was the only advantage that mattered. The advantage was a fleeting thing, a ghost in itself. Isaac knew this. Being one step ahead was not a permanent state of being. It was a moment, a breath of air stolen before the next plunge. The whispers of his phantom persona had bought the community a fragile reprieve, but he knew the beast he had kicked was not dead, it was merely wounded. And a wounded beast is the most dangerous kind. He had humiliated them, and for men who built their world on the fragile scaffolding of pride and dominance. Humiliation was a poison that demanded a violent antidote. He waited, listening not just with his ears but with his entire being, feeling the vibrations of the town's fear, waiting for the inevitable response. The response was being formulated in a room that smelled of leather, bourbon, and self-righteous fury. The study of Beaumont, a wealthy and cruel plantation owner whose family had owned half the county for generations, was a monument to his own perceived greatness. The walls were adorned with the mounted heads of deer and bear, their glass eyes staring out with a permanent placid surprise that stood in stark contrast to the seething rage of the room's occupant. Confederate memorabilia, a cavalry saber here, a framed flag there, served as sacred relics of a world Beaumont was desperately trying to resurrect. He was the secret Grand Cyclops of the redemption chapter of the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, and at this moment, he was a man possessed by a fury so cold and deep it seemed to lower the temperature of the room. He slammed a clenched fist down on his polished mahogany desk, the sound making his lieutenant, a man named Carter who stood nervously by the fireplace, jump. The crystal whiskey decanter rattled, its amber contents trembling. "One man?" Beaumont's voice was not a shout. It was a low, venomous hiss, more terrifying than any yell. "You were routed by one man in a mask, a single solitary creature of the swamp, and a dozen of my best men were sent scattering like frightened children." Carter swallowed hard, his own hood now resting on a nearby chair, his face pale and sweaty in the lamplight. Beaumont, it wasn't natural. The way he moved, the sounds, the horses, Beaumont's eyes, the color of a winter sky, snapped to him. "Do not give me excuses born of superstition, Carter. You were beaten. You were humiliated. And by extension, I was humiliated." He rose from his chair and began to pace, his movements like those of a caged panther. "This is an affront to the natural order. This is the rot that sets in when weakness is allowed to fester. We showed them mercy, a guiding hand to remind them of their place. And this is our reward." He stopped and turned, his face a mask of chilling certainty. "The time for guidance is over. The time for purification is at hand. We will ride in force. We will burn the Washington place to the ground, and we will salt the earth so that nothing, not even a weed of defiance, can ever grow there again. We will make an example so brutal, so absolute, that no one will ever dare dream of resistance again." He paused, a cruel smile touching his lips, "and in doing so, we will draw him out. This phantom of yours, he has a savior's complex. He will not be able to resist. And when he comes, I want him crushed. I want his body. And I want it dragged through the center of town for all to see." Beaumont was no mere thug. He was an ideologue, a man who saw his cruelty not as a sin but as a sacred duty to preserve his vision of racial order. He was intelligent, he was ruthless, and he was now utterly obsessed. Isaac knew he needed better information. The whispers in the community were born of hope and fear, but they were not intelligence. He needed to get inside the enemy's head, and to do that, he needed someone on the inside. His thoughts turned to Elias, a young, literate black man who worked as a stable hand at Beaumont's sprawling plantation, a place called Oak Haven. It was a dangerous thought, one that could get the young man killed. But the alternative, riding blind into whatever Beaumont was planning, was worse. He sent a coded message through a trusted channel. A washerwoman who served several of the large properties, and arranged a meeting. They met in a dense thicket of blackberry and honeysuckle, far from the main house and any prying eyes, the air thick with the sweet scent of the blossoms and the metallic tang of fear. Elias arrived like a ghost, his eyes wide and darting, his body trembling so violently Isaac could see it from 10 paces away. He was terrified, but he had come. That was all that mattered. "They're planning something big, sir," Elias whispered, his voice cracking. He clutched a book in his hands, a tattered copy of Shakespeare, as if its weight could anchor him to the spot. "I heard Mr. Beaumont. In his study, he was shouting. He's talking about burning and killing. He wants to go back to the Washington farm." Elias looked up at Isaac, his eyes filled with a desperate awe. "He wants you. He called you a creature, a demon from the swamp. He says he's going to make an example that will burn for a generation." Isaac remained perfectly calm, in his presence a steadying rock in the young man's sea of terror. He placed a hand on Elias's shoulder, the gesture firm and reassuring. "Your courage in coming to me will save lives, Elias. You are a braver man than any of them." The simple words of praise seemed to give Elias a measure of strength. His trembling subsided slightly. "Tell me everything you heard," Isaac said, his voice low and even. "Every word. What route will they take? How many men?" Elias, his memory sharp and his mind quick, recounted the details of Beaumont's furious plan. He described the route, a backwoods trail that would keep them hidden from the main road. He gave an estimate of the numbers, nearly 24 men, more than before. He spoke of their weapons, their mood, their thirst for a decisive, brutal victory, a bond of trust, forged in shared danger and a desperate hope for justice, was sealed there in the secret quiet of the thicket. Elias, the boy who read plays about kings and tragedies, had just stepped onto a stage far more dangerous than any he had ever imagined. Armed with Elias's precise information, Isaac prepared for war. He knew the Klan's route to the Washington farm intimately. Every twist, every turn, every creek bed and fallen log. He knew he could not meet a force of 24 men head-on. That was their way of fighting, a way defined by brute force and overwhelming numbers. His way was the way of the scout, the way of the hunter. He would not meet them. He would dismantle them. For 2 days, he worked tirelessly along the wooded trail they would travel. He became a part of the landscape, a silent, purposeful force of nature preparing for the storm. Near the start of the trail, he spent half a day with an axe and a saw, weakening the trunk of a massive dead oak tree. He rigged a system of ropes, allowing him to bring it down from a distance, creating an impassable barrier that would force them off the main path and into a narrower, more treacherous game trail he had selected. Along this new path, he set his traps. They were not meant to kill, but to confound, to injure, and to terrify. He stretched vines taut between trees at the height of a horse's chest, designed to unseat a rider in the dark. He dug shallow pits and covered them with a flimsy lattice of branches and leaves. He used his knowledge of the woods to create diversions, hanging strips of cloth that would flutter in the breeze like ghostly apparitions, and preparing to use his own voice to mimic the eerie, supernatural calls of owls and bobcats, playing directly on the superstitions his phantom persona had already cultivated. As night fell and the clan rode out from Oak Haven, their mood was grim but determined. Beaumont led them, his back straight, his ornate hood a beacon of authority in the torchlight. They were a disciplined column of riders, an instrument of terror ready to be unleashed. But as they turned onto the backwoods trail, their world began to unravel. The first sign of trouble was the sudden, thunderous crash of the great oak falling across their path, blocking it completely. Curses and shouts filled the air. Beaumont, enraged by the delay, ordered them onto the narrow game trail. It was there that the forest itself seemed to turn against them. A rider at the front of the column let out a strangled cry as a vine caught him across the chest, throwing him violently from his saddle. Moments later, another horse screamed as its leg plunged into a hidden pit. Panic began to ripple through the ranks. Eerie calls echoed from the trees around them, sounds that were almost familiar but twisted into something monstrous and unsettling. The organized raid descended into a paranoid, chaotic mess. Men became separated in the darkness, their torches casting dancing, menacing shadows. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves became the sound of the phantom hunter. They were no longer a confident posse. They were a collection of terrified, isolated men, lost in a forest that wanted them gone, hunted by a ghost who seemed to be everywhere at once. In the height of the confusion, Isaac saw his moment. Beaumont, furious and trying to restore order, had pushed ahead of his main group, accompanied only by Carter. They had become separated, isolated. This was the opportunity Isaac had engineered. He urged Midnight forward, the horse moving like a black river through the trees, and emerged onto the path directly in front of the two clansmen. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, the Grand Cyclops and the Phantom Rider were face to face. The moonlight filtered through the canopy, dappling the scene in an ethereal, silver light. Beaumont's face, visible through the eye slits of his hood, was a mask of pure fury. "There you are, you devil," he snarled, pulling a large Colt revolver from his belt. But before he could raise the weapon to fire, Isaac's bullwhip, a black serpent in the moonlight, cracked through the air. The lash did not strike Beaumont's body. It was a move of impossible surgical precision. The leather tip wrapped itself expertly around the pointed peak of the Grand Cyclops' ornate silk hood. With a sharp, powerful tug, Isaac snatched it clean off his head. Beaumont's shocked, pale face was suddenly exposed. His neatly trimmed beard and cold, calculating eyes laid bare in the moonlight for his lieutenant to see. His mouth hung open in disbelief, his expression a mixture of shock, rage, and, for the first time, a flicker of genuine fear. The symbol of his power, the source of his authority and terror, was gone. Isaac said nothing. The silence was the final, crushing blow. He held the stolen hood in his hand, a trophy, a declaration. Then, he wheeled Midnight around, the powerful horse turning on a dime, and melted back into the darkness as silently as he had appeared, leaving Beaumont standing on the trail, unmasked, unarmed, and utterly humiliated before his own man. The conflict was no longer about a town or a people. It was now deeply, irrevocably personal. The humiliation was a physical presence in Beaumont's study, a phantom more real and more suffocating than the one his men whispered about. It clung to the velvet curtains, soured the expensive bourbon in his decanter, and stared back at him from the dead glass eyes of his hunting trophies. The stolen hood was a void, an absence that screamed his failure. His raw, explosive fury had cooled, solidifying into something far more dangerous. A cold, crystalline obsession. He no longer paced like a caged animal. He sat behind his mahogany desk, perfectly still, his fingers steepled, his eyes fixed on the empty space where the ornate symbol of his power should have been. The humiliation had been a painful but necessary lesson. Brute force had failed. An army of men had been dismantled by a ghost. Therefore, the ghost would not be fought with an army, but with a hook. His lieutenant, Carter, stood by the window, nervously watching the twilight bleed across the manicured lawns of Oak Haven. He still flinched whenever Beaumont spoke. "He is arrogant," Beaumont said, his voice a low, controlled murmur that was infinitely more menacing than his previous rage. "This creature, this phantom, he believes he is a savior, a protector of the weak. It is the fatal flaw of his kind, a sentimentality that clouds judgment." He picked up a silver letter opener, turning it over and over in his fingers, the polished metal catching the lamplight. "We tried to crush him with a hammer, and he slipped through the cracks. Now, we will bait a hook with something he cannot possibly resist." Carter turned from the window. "What kind of bait, Beaumont?" Beaumont allowed a thin, cruel smile to touch his lips. "The most tempting kind. The bait of righteousness." He leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with a newfound cunning. "There is a poor white farmer, a man named Jedediah, a known Union sympathizer. He occasionally hires black farmhands, pays them a fair wage. He is, in short, a traitor to his blood and a thorn in the side of our cause." He set the letter opener down with a soft click. "I have already had a rumor started, passed through a source that will surely reach our phantom's ears. The rumor is simple. The knights are riding to punish Jedediah for his sympathies. We will make an example of him tonight." Carter's brow furrowed in confusion. "But we're telling him where we'll be. Isn't that the same mistake as before?" Beaumont's smile widened. "That is the beauty of it, Carter. He will think we are fools. He will believe we are predictable. His ego, his belief that he is our master, will demand that he ride to the aid of a white sympathizer. It proves his power is not about race, but about justice. It is a temptation he is psychologically incapable of resisting." He rose and walked to a map of the county pinned to the wall. "This time, we will not ride in force. We will not carry torches. We will be silent. We will be the ghosts. My men are already moving into position, hidden in the tree line, in the ditches, in Jedediah's own barn. They will be waiting, and when our savior appears, silhouetted against the moon, they will not try to capture him. They will not try to unmask him. They will shoot to kill. I want his body riddled with so much lead it sinks in water." He turned back to Carter, his face alight with a feverish, predatory glee. "I want his corpse dragged through the center of redemption at dawn. I want the legend to die a very public, very bloody death." The plan was a testament to his adaptation. He had moved beyond the simple thuggery of his followers and into the realm of psychological warfare, turning the Phantom Rider's own perceived virtues into the mechanism of his doom. He was no longer just a bully. He was a hunter, and he was laying the perfect trap. The news of the planned raid on Jedediah's farm reached Isaac through Elias, the young stable hand who had become his unwilling but resolute eyes and ears inside Oak Haven. They met in their usual spot, the dense thicket now shrouded in the deep purple of twilight. Elias was more terrified than ever, his words tumbling out in a rushed, breathless whisper. He relayed the rumor he had been instructed to overhear, the story of the Klan's righteous fury being turned on the white sympathizer Jedediah. But as Isaac listened, a profound sense of wrongness settled over him. His instincts, honed by years of tracking men who did not want to be found, screamed that this was a lie. He stood perfectly still, letting Elias's words wash over him, but his mind was racing, analyzing the information not for what it said, but for what it meant. Beaumont had been publicly and personally humiliated. A man like that, a man whose entire identity was built on a foundation of dominance and perceived superiority, did not respond to such an insult by loudly announcing his next move. A humiliated predator does not roar before it strikes. It grows silent. It waits. It lays a trap. "This feels wrong," Isaac murmured, more to himself than to Elias. "It's too loud. It's too obvious." He looked at the young man, whose face was a mask of earnest fear. Beaumont isn't a fool. He's arrogant, but he's not a fool. He's baiting a hook. The realization settled in his gut with the cold weight of a stone. They weren't going for Jedediah. They were going for him. Jedediah was just the cheese. Isaac placed a firm hand on Elias's shoulder, steadying the young man's trembling. "Thank you, Elias. You have done a great service tonight. Now, listen to me very carefully. Do not go back to the plantation tonight. Find a place to hide, somewhere no one would think to look for you. Do not let anyone see you until morning. Do you understand?" Elias nodded, his eyes wide with a new kind of fear, the fear of the unknown. He understood he was part of a game whose rules he could not comprehend. He scurried away into the darkness, leaving Isaac alone with the chilling certainty of the trap that had been laid for him. Isaac did not go to his cabin to retrieve the black garments of the phantom rider. He did not saddle the mighty midnight. Instead, he stripped himself of any excess gear, keeping only his knife, his revolver, and his wits. He would not ride into this ambush. He would stalk it. He would approach it not as a legend, but as a scout, on foot, and under the cover of the deepest shadows. The moon was a sliver of bone in the black sky as Isaac moved through the woods surrounding Jedediah's farm. He moved like a ghost, a whisper of motion, his feet making no sound on the damp earth. The air was still and heavy, pregnant with a silence that felt unnatural, manufactured. As he drew closer, the silence began to resolve itself into 1,000 tiny, hidden sounds. The creak of a leather strap, the muffled cough of a man trying to stay quiet, the glint of moonlight off a rifle barrel carelessly shifted. He saw the first one in the deep shadow of a large oak, a man-shaped lump of darkness that was too still, too rigid to be a part of the natural landscape. Then he saw another, lying flat in a shallow ditch by the road. His eyes, accustomed to peering through the deceptions of the night, began to pick them out, one by one. There were dozens of them. They were hidden in the tree line, crouched behind the stone walls that bordered the fields, concealed in the hayloft of Jedediah's barn. They formed a perfect concentric circle of death around the small, unsuspecting farmhouse. It was a kill box, Isaac's blood ran cold. He had been right. The sheer scale of the ambush, the discipline of their silence, was terrifying. He was moving along the edge of a swampy creek bed that bordered the farm when he heard it, the squelch of boots in the mud. Too close. A patrol, 2 men, was moving along the bank just above him. There was no time to run, no cover to be found. He did the only thing he could. He slid silently into the murky, stagnant water of the creek. The water was shockingly cold, the mud at the bottom thick and grasping, sucking at his boots. He submerged himself completely, the foul-smelling water closing over his head. He had prepared for this possibility. A hollow reed held ready in his hand. He positioned the end of the reed just above the surface, a tiny, natural-looking straw amidst the algae and scum. He held his breath, his body rigid, every muscle screaming in protest against the cold. The sound of his own heartbeat was a deafening drum in his ears. He could hear the Klansmen's boots just feet away. He could hear their low, guttural whispers. "See anything?" one asked. "Nothing. Quiet as a tomb," the other replied. "Good. I want to be the one that gets him. Beaumont's paying a bonus." They moved on. Isaac remained submerged, the seconds stretching into an eternity. The water was filled with unseen things that brushed against his skin. He felt the slick, muscular body of a snake glide over his leg, and it took every ounce of his discipline not to recoil. This was the closest he had ever come to death, not in the heat of battle, but here, helpless and alone in a stinking creek, breathing through a fragile reed. The vulnerability shook him to his core. The legend felt 1,000 miles away. He was just a man drowning in the dark, a man who had almost made a fatal mistake after what felt like a lifetime. He risked raising his head from the water. The patrol was gone. He pulled himself from the creek, his clothes heavy with mud and slime, his body shaking uncontrollably from the cold and the adrenaline. He had escaped, but the trap was still set. He could not ride in, but he could not simply leave. Leaving meant they would win. It meant they would wait all night for a ghost that never came. And in the morning, their frustration might well be taken out on Jedediah and his family. He had to turn their strategy against them. He had to pull them away. An idea sparked in his mind, a desperate, brilliant gamble. He would not spring their trap. He would set a fire, not just any fire, but a fire they could not ignore. He began to move, a swift and silent shadow running through the woods, no longer stalking, but racing. He traveled for miles, circling wide around the ambush site, his destination the one place their loyalty would be most divided, Oak Haven, Beaumont's own sprawling plantation. He reached the edge of Beaumont's vast property, a kingdom built on the sweat and blood of others. He found what he was looking for, a massive hayfield, the grass dry as tinder from the late autumn heat. The wind was blowing steadily, a strong breeze moving away from the main house and toward an empty stretch of forest. It was perfect. He worked quickly, creating a small pile of the driest grass and twigs. With his flint and steel, he struck a spark. A tiny flame flickered, then caught. He nurtured it, fed it, until it grew into a hungry, crackling fire. Then he stepped back and watched. The wind took the flames and spread them with astonishing speed. The fire roared across the dry field, a wave of orange and red that devoured everything in its path. It created a massive blaze, a pillar of smoke and light that could be seen for miles, a false dawn rising in the west. The clansmen waiting in ambush at Jedediah's farm were thrown into confusion. The distant glow was unmistakable. It was in the direction of Oak Haven. Their discipline, so rigid just moments before, shattered. Their loyalty was split. Were they to hold their positions for a phantom that might never appear, or race to save the property and wealth of their leader? For most, the choice was simple. Greed and self-preservation won out. Shouts erupted as men abandoned their posts, running for their horses, their trap forgotten in the face of a direct threat to their master's fortune. As the ambush dissolved into a panicked race to fight the fire, Isaac made his move. He retrieved Midnight, the great horse sensing his master's urgency. He did not ride toward the fire. He rode toward the now empty town of Redemption. The town square was deserted, bathed in the eerie glow of the distant blaze. Isaac dismounted in the center of the square, in front of the public notice board where proclamations and laws were posted. From inside his shirt, he pulled the stolen ornate silk hood of the Grand Cyclops. He flattened it against the wooden board. Then, he drew his razor-sharp Bowie knife. With a single powerful motion, he plunged the knife through the center of the hood, pinning it firmly to the board. The blade quivered, its steel gleaming in the moonlight. He left it there, a stark and silent message for all to see in the morning light. The message was clear, brutal, and deeply personal. It said, "I was not in your trap. I was at your home. I know who you are, and I can get to you anywhere." Beaumont's authority, once as solid and imposing as the marble mantelpiece in his study, had been shattered into 1,000 pieces. The public display of his stolen hood, pinned like a dead moth to the town's notice board, was an act of psychological warfare so profound it had fundamentally altered the balance of power in Redemption. It had made him a laughingstock among his enemies and, far worse, a figure of ridicule among his own wavering followers. Men who had once trembled at his command now exchanged sideways glances and whispered behind his back. His carefully constructed edifice of fear and respect had crumbled overnight, leaving him exposed and powerless. His men, spooked by a phantom who seemed to be omniscient, who could walk through walls and set fires at will, were deserting in droves. They were simple men, motivated by a mixture of hatred, boredom, and the promise of power. They had signed up to be the terrifying specters of the night, not the terrified victims of one. In his study, the air thick with the scent of stale bourbon and defeat, Beaumont was a man transformed. The cold, calculating strategist was gone, replaced by a desperate fanatic. His eyes held a wild, feverish gleam, the look of a zealot who has seen his God defiled. He had called for one last secret meeting, gathering the last of his loyal, hardcore followers, the ones whose hatred was as pure and personal as his own. This was not a call for a raid or a simple act of terror. This was a summons for a ritual. "He is one man," Beaumont's voice cracked, echoing in the cavernous room. He stood before the fireplace, his shadow dancing on the wall like a demon sent to test our resolve, to test the purity of our blood and our cause. The lesser men have fled, the chaff has been separated from the wheat. Only you, the true believers, remain. He looked at the dozen faces staring back at him, men whose loyalty was now cemented by their shared humiliation. We will not hunt him as men. We will hunt him as an order. We will perform the sacred rite of the blood hunt, and we will send this creature back to the hell that spawned him. This is for our blood, for our land, for our way of life, which he seeks to burn to the ground." His voice dropped to a conspiratorial, venomous whisper, his rage coiling into a single point of action. "We meet at the old burned-out church by the river, at the rising of the full moon. Tonight, we will end this. We will wash our honor clean in his blood." The conflict had reached its boiling point. Beaumont had abandoned all pretense of a wider cause, of restoring order or protecting a way of life. His motivation was now purely, nakedly personal. It was the desperate gambit of a king who had lost his crown and had nothing left to wager but his own soul. Elias heard the plan. He was not meant to. He had been cleaning the tack in the stables, his hands busy but his ears straining, catching the fragments of Beaumont's unhinged speech as he addressed his lieutenants near the stable door. The words, "burned church," "full moon," and "sacred rite," chilled him to the bone. He knew this was the endgame. The terror that had been his constant companion for weeks now threatened to swallow him whole. But beneath it, a different feeling had taken root, a hard, defiant resolve planted by Isaac's quiet courage. He knew he had to act. This was his greatest risk, a risk that offered no reward, only the possibility of a brutal, lonely death. Waiting until the deepest point of the night, when the plantation was asleep and the only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the distant call of a whippoorwill, Elias slipped out of his small room above the stables. He didn't take the road. He moved through the fields and woods, a small, terrified shadow flitting from one patch of darkness to the next, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He found Isaac in the ruins of the old Granger cabin, a place that had become their unspoken meeting point. Isaac was not preparing for a ride. He was cleaning his revolver with a slow, methodical calm that seemed to radiate into the tense night air. Elias burst in, breathless and pale with terror, his words tumbling out in a frantic rush. "The old church by the river," he gasped, leaning against the doorframe to keep from collapsing. "Tonight, at the full moon, he's gathering all his leaders, all the ones who are left." He looked at Isaac, his eyes pleading. "It's a trap, Isaac. I know it's a trap, but it's also all of them, all in one place. He means to kill you for good." He called it a sacred hunt. Isaac stopped his work. He looked at the young man, at his heaving chest and his terrified eyes, and he felt a profound sense of gratitude and sorrow. He rose and walked over, placing a firm, steadying hand on Elias's shoulder. The simple touch seemed to drain the panic from the young man, leaving only a trembling exhaustion. "You've done more than enough, Elias," Isaac said, his voice low and filled with a quiet power. "You have done a brave and noble thing. You are a hero." He squeezed the young man's shoulder gently. "Now go. Get somewhere safe. Find a place in the woods and do not come out. Don't let anyone see you until this is over. This ends tonight." Elias nodded, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. He looked at Isaac one last time, a look of awe and fear, then turned and vanished back into the night, his part in the war of shadows finally over. Isaac knew he might not survive this night. He was not walking into a fight. He was walking into a ritual designed for his destruction. Before he became the Phantom Rider one last time, There was one final thing he had to do. He went to Sarah's farm. The small cabin was dark save for a single lamp burning in the window. He found her on the porch, rocking slowly in her chair, a shotgun resting across her lap. She looked up as he approached, her eyes sharp and knowing. She did not ask where he was going or what he was about to do. The finality of his visit hung in the air between them, unspoken but deeply understood. "You be careful out there, son," she said, her voice raspy but strong. "The night has teeth." Isaac stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at the woman who was the last link to his past, to the life he had known before the war, before the hoods, before the phantom. "I know," he replied, his voice soft. "But so do I." Sarah nodded slowly, a silent acknowledgement of the man he had become. She rose and went inside, saying she would fetch him a cup of water for his journey. In that brief moment, while she was gone, Isaac moved to the side of her old, weathered barn. He ran his hand along the familiar timber until his fingers found what they were looking for: a large, flat stone in the foundation that had been loose for as long as he could remember. He worked it free, revealing a dark, cool space within the wall. From inside his shirt, he pulled his small, leather-bound journal. He held it for a moment, the weight of it in his hand feeling heavier than ever before. It contained the truth, his truth, the story of why the phantom had been born. He placed the journal carefully into the hidden nook, then slid the stone back into place, ensuring it was snug and looked undisturbed. He was ensuring his story, his reason, would be preserved even if he fell. It was an act of legacy, a final, quiet defiance against the forces that sought to erase him and his people from history. When Sarah returned with the water, he was standing by the steps again, his face calm and unreadable. He drank the water, thanked her, and walked away into the darkness without looking back. The transformation was different this time. As he pulled on the black canvas shirt and trousers, as he strapped the Colt revolver to his hip and affixed the leather mask to his face, it was not with the cold rage of his first ride, nor the grim determination of the hunts that followed. It was with a solemn, final purpose. He was no longer just a hunter. He felt like an executioner, not of men, but of an idea, a sickness that had poisoned his home. As he saddled midnight, a storm began to gather on the distant horizon. The air grew heavy and thick, charged with electricity. A low, deep rumble of thunder echoed from the west, a sound like distant artillery, a familiar and unsettling prelude to battle. The approaching storm was a mirror to his own internal state, a controlled tempest, a fury held in check, ready to be unleashed with precision and overwhelming force. He rode toward the ruined church, the wind picking up, whipping at his clothes and carrying the scent of rain and damp earth. The location was fitting, a house of God, a place of sanctuary and peace, burned to the ground by the very hatred he was riding to confront. It was a stage perfectly set for the final act of this tragedy. He was calm, his mind clear and focused, his senses sharp. He was prepared to meet his fate, whatever it might be. Tucked into his belt, alongside his knife, was a new item, a piece of his evolving strategy. It was the soiled, common hood of a regular Klansman, taken as a trophy from a previous skirmish. It was a tool of deception, a scout's trick for a soldier's war. He was not just riding to a battle. He was infiltrating the enemy's temple on the eve of their most sacred rite. The skeletal ruins of the old church clawed at the stormy sky, its burned timbers like the ribs of a long dead beast. Isaac arrived not with a thunderous charge, but as a whisper on the wind. The storm, his only ally, was closer now, the air thick and electric, each distant rumble of thunder a drumbeat counting down to the final confrontation. He dismounted in a grove of water oaks 100 yards away, calming midnight with a soft touch to his neck. The horse stood steady, a creature of the night, patient and silent. On foot, Isaac moved toward the faint, flickering light emanating from the church's hollowed-out shell. In the deep shadows just outside the circle of torchlight, he stopped. He pulled the dirty, common clansman's hood from his belt. The rough fabric smelled of sweat, fear, and stale hatred. Pulling it over his head, over his own black leather mask, was a violation, a contamination of his purpose, but it was a necessary one. The world swam, reduced to a narrow, distorted view through the crudely cut eye slits. He was now one of them, a ghost among ghosts. He slipped from the shadows and merged with the figures milling around the ruins. There were about a dozen of them, the hardcore, the last of the faithful. In the chaotic, dancing torchlight and the growing darkness of the storm, he was just another faceless member of the congregation of hate. No one gave him a second glance. He listened, his senses straining behind the suffocating mask. He heard their nervous whispers, their boasts laced with a terror they were trying to suppress. Then, a voice cut through the murmurs, sharp and commanding. Beaumont. He stood upon the ruined stone altar, a new ornate hood on his head, a replacement for the one Isaac had taken. He was a high priest addressing his acolytes. "They say he is a demon," Beaumont's voice rang out, filled with a fanatical fervor. "But we are the instruments of God's own wrath. He is a test of our sacred resolve." Beaumont's tirade was a venomous sermon, a litany of grievances and a call for purification by blood. He began to name them, his key lieutenants, pointing to each one in turn, his voice swelling with theatrical importance. "Carter, my right hand, who will lead the first charge. Jennings, whose loyalty has never wavered. And Cobb, who will have the honor of the final blow." Isaac, hidden in their midst, committed each name, each face behind the hood, to memory. Beaumont was not just giving a speech. He was signing their death warrants, exposing his entire inner circle in his hubris. He was making Isaac's work for him. As Beaumont's hateful rhetoric reached a crescendo, his arm raised to the turbulent sky as if to command the storm itself. Isaac acted. He did not draw his gun. He uncoiled his whip. With a single fluid motion, the black leather lash shot out, not at a man, but at the main torch stand near the altar. The whip wrapped around the metal pole, and Isaac pulled. Hard, the stand toppled with a crash of metal and a shower of sparks, plunging the ruins into a sudden, profound darkness, broken only by the intermittent, brilliant flashes of lightning from the heavens. Panic erupted. Men shouted in confusion, stumbling into one another, their monstrous forms reduced to a mob of frightened, blind men. In the chaos, Isaac vaulted onto the altar. The storm, as if on cue, broke. Rain began to pour down in thick, cold sheets, hissing on the hot stones and turning the ground to slick mud. Beaumont, blinded and enraged, spun around, his hand flying to the revolver at his belt. "Who are you?" He screamed into the disorienting dark, his voice a mixture of fury and raw terror. "Show yourself, demon!" A brilliant, searing flash of lightning split the sky, illuminating the scene for a frozen second. A perfect tableau of judgment. Isaac stood before him on the altar. He slowly, deliberately, reached up and pulled off the filthy Klan hood, dropping it into the mud. Then, his eyes locked on Beaumont's. He reached up again and removed his own black leather mask. Beaumont's face, caught in the afterimage of the lightning, twisted in a rictus of shock and utter disbelief. He saw not a demon, not a phantom from the swamp, but the face of Isaac Granger, the black man, the former scout, the quiet farmer he had dismissed and underestimated. It was a recognition so profound it shattered his world. "I'm the freedom you thought you could burn," Isaac said, his voice low and cold. A quiet promise of retribution that was more terrifying than any shout. The fight was not a duel of honor. It was a raw, brutal struggle for dominance in the mud and the driving rain. Beaumont, recovering from his shock with a surge of pure animalistic rage, lunged forward. He was a big man, strong from a life of leisure and casual cruelty, but Isaac's body was a weapon honed by war and necessity. His combat training, the muscle memory of 100 desperate fights, took over. Beaumont swung a wild punch, and Isaac slipped under it, the motion fluid and economical. He drove his shoulder into Beaumont's midsection, knocking the air from his lungs with a pained grunt. They grappled on the slick stones of the altar, a chaotic dance of limbs in the strobing lightning. Beaumont's strength was born of fury, but Isaac's was cold and focused. He systematically dismantled his opponent. A sharp blow to the wrist sent Beaumont's revolver flying into the darkness. A precisely aimed kick to the back of the knee brought the larger man crashing down to one knee. Isaac gave him no quarter. He did not kill him. Death would be an escape, an easy martyrdom. He wanted to break him, to strip him of everything he was. He forced Beaumont onto his stomach, twisting his arm behind his back until he cried out in pain. With a length of rope from his belt, Isaac bound his hands tightly. The great grand Cyclops, the master of redemption, was helpless. In a final act of symbolic justice, Isaac grabbed the pointed silk hood and ripped it from Beaumont's head, leaving him exposed and defeated on the muddy altar of his own ruined church. Just then, the other Klansmen, having managed to light a few new torches, began to close in. They raised their weapons, their faces a mixture of confusion and menace. But as the torchlight fell upon the altar, they stopped dead. They saw their revered, all-powerful leader, unmasked, bound, and utterly helpless, a pathetic figure sobbing in the mud. The illusion of his power, the very foundation of their order, was shattered. They were not looking at a demon they had been sent to hunt. They were looking at a man, and they saw that their leader was just another man, a failed one. The sight broke them. There were no more shouts of defiance. One by one, they lowered their torches. They looked at each other, their own facelessness now a source of shame, not strength. Then they turned and fled, melting back into the stormy night, abandoning their God on his broken altar. Isaac Granger was never seen in the town of Redemption again. The phantom rider, his purpose served, vanished with the morning mist. He left Beaumont tied to the altar for the dawn to reveal, a living monument to his own failure. With their leader exposed and their ranks broken and scattered, The Klan's reign of terror in the region came to an abrupt end. The night raids stopped. The burnings ceased. A fragile, tentative peace began to settle over the land. The town slowly began to heal. People still walked with caution, their eyes still holding a shadow of the fear that had been their constant companion. But the suffocating blanket of dread had been lifted. They could breathe again. The whispers in the community changed. They no longer spoke of the white-robed monsters who came in the night. Instead, on quiet evenings, they spoke in hushed, awed tones of a guardian, a dark horseman who had ridden out of the storm and delivered a justice the law would not. They spoke of the phantom rider. The fear of the night had been replaced by a legend of it. Many years passed. The seasons turned, and the scars on the land and the people began to fade. Sarah's old farm, long since abandoned after her peaceful passing, stood quiet and empty, a slow victim to the patient siege of time and nature. One hot summer night, a storm, much like the one that had marked the Phantom Rider's final ride, rolled across the Alabama hills. A bolt of lightning, jagged and white-hot, struck the dry, ancient timber of the old barn. The structure, a tinderbox of memory, caught fire instantly and burned to the ground, a final, fiery punctuation to a long-forgotten chapter. A few days later, a young boy, the grandson of a man who remembered the time of fear, was picking through the charred, blackened ruins, searching for old bottles or interesting relics. His hand, sifting through the ash and debris near the foundation, brushed against something hard and cool. He dug it out. It was a small, scorched metal box, warped by the heat but still intact. With some effort, he pried the lid open. Inside, nestled in the remains of what might have been oilcloth, was a small, leather-bound journal. Most of its pages were fused together or burned away to black, brittle lace by the intense heat of the fire. But as the boy carefully turned the fragile remains, he found the last page, miraculously preserved in the center of the book. The script was faded but written in a strong, clear hand. He could make out the final haunting line. It read, "They came in hoods. I rode in theirs. The story ends. But the legend of the Phantom Rider lives on in the region. A ghost story told to children, and a cautionary tale whispered by old men. Locals still say that on the stormiest nights, when the wind howls through the pines and the world is washed clean by the rain, you can sometimes hear the faint, ghostly echo of hoofbeats on the old trails, a timeless reminder that when evil men don their masks, a hero must sometimes don one of his own, a silent rider keeping watch from the distant dark hills."